All right, so we have a basic function here where we have basically a ratio function that's taking x and y. We're going to get the ratio or the result of dividing x by y. And then we also have digits where we can round the result to some specified input. Right now, this requires us to call all three of these arguments, right? But lots of times there are arguments that we probably want the user just to only call if necessary, but just have smart defaults. And this is quite common where you'll see maybe the first 2 or 3 arguments basically require the user to provide some input, but then all the arguments that follow that, or the parameters that follow that, will have defaults, sound defaults, but the user can change them if necessary, but they're not required to pass all of them. So let's go ahead and do that. And the first part of this knowledge check is set the digits parameter to equal to 2, right? And we can do that. We can just simply say digits equals 2. And the nice thing about that is now, here, let me go ahead and I can even simplify this, because what we can do is we can just allow the user to just simply pass 1 and 3 without calling x and y. And we can see, go ahead, run that. And now what we can see is if we don't call digits, right? Digits is just going to default to 2. But the nice thing is the user could always say, well, hey, look, this makes sense for a default, but I want to change this. I want to change this to 3. And now the user has control to modify that if necessary. All right, the next part of this knowledge check was add type hints that specify x and y to be numeric and digits to be an integer, and the output returned to be a float. All right, so as you saw, type hints are a way that we can kind of help the user understand what's expected for their inputs. And this is handy. This is actually handy in many different ways. As you get into developing like functions and packages, there's ways that we can reduce the errors and bugs that occur by including type hints. But at the most basic level, type hints can be used by the end user to understand what should be supplied. All right. So if we look at our function here, we can see that, well, look, we want our x and y input to be numeric, but we really don't care if it's a float or an integer. Okay. So how can we do this? Well, what we need to do first of all is, let's go ahead and before I even do that, I could say, look, I want x to be a float. I want y to be a float. And I want digits, I said, to be an integer, but we're going to still allow that to default to 2. And then what I can have is my output can be a float. All right. So now when we do this, right, I can still execute this code here and it's going to work, but you're going to notice that, you know what, actually what I'm supplying is an integer and an integer when it's saying float, right? We really don't care if x and y is a float or an integer. So how we can do that is we can say from typing, which is a standard library, import union, and we can use union in a way that says, look, the actual type here can be a float or it can be an int, right? And I can say that for both our x and y, okay? So now we're saying, hey, look, you could pass either a float or an int, and this function is not going to care, right? So here's the nice thing about this. Now, when somebody looks for the help information for a ratio, what they're going to see is, look, the signature says right away, hey, x, we expect it to be either a float or an int. Y, we expect it to be either a float or an int. Digits, we expect it to be an integer. And the output is going to be a float. So that's helpful, right? So as a user trying to use this function, I could quickly look and be like, this is what it expects. I should not be passing any kind of like a character string in for one of these arguments.